welcome to the podcast, Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path. I'm your host, Mike Allen. You know, we've done a lot of episodes on the Revolutionary War in Connecticut. Today, we're going to do one on the War of 1812. The biggest loss of shipping suffered by the U.S. during that war, and in fact, from that war up until Pearl Harbor, occurred right here in Connecticut. It happened when the British raided Pettapog. You don't know Pettapog? Well, today it goes by the name Essex. And what a raid it was. Just wait until you hear. Here to tell us about it is Jerry Roberts. He wrote the definitive book on this topic, The British Raid on Essex, and he served as the battlefield historian for the National Park Service to research the raid, and he's a former director of the Connecticut River Museum, which is located in Essex Village, right where that raid took place. Jerry now serves as president of the Deep River Historical Society in the town next door to Essex, and he consults for a number of museums, towns, and organizations. He's going to be along in just a moment. This week's trivia question: it's often called Connecticut's most abundant natural resource. What is it? Stick around after the main program for that answer, because then you'll know the topic for next week's show. Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path is brought to you by our sponsor, Yale New Haven Health. When people need the best quality health care, there's a reason they turn to Yale New Haven Health. In 1826, Yale New Haven Hospital became Connecticut's very first hospital. They were the first hospital in the U.S. to use chemotherapy. Yale New Haven was the first to introduce insulin pumps for diabetic patients, and they introduced the world's first intensive care unit for newborns. For more information about Yale New Haven Health, visit ynhhs.org. That's ynhhs.org. When you're talking about military strategy and you're looking for a perfect seaport, well, few locations would be as ideal as Essex, Connecticut. It's 6 miles up the Connecticut River from Long Island Sound, which is just far enough to make it secure and kind of hard to access around a couple of bends in the river for the enemy. But it's close enough for us that it provides good access to Long Island Sound. And so it was in 1812 that Essex, which in those days was called Pettapog, was booming. It was a shipbuilding community, and it was a port for the many sea captains who docked their merchant trading vessels there in between runs on the high seas. Well, as you're about to hear, though, those good times at Pettapog were about to get worse, much worse. The War of 1812 posed significant problems for Connecticut sea traders, and you're going to hear all about that. And by April of 1814, the steps that Pettapog had taken to fight back against the British in the war, well, it came back to hit them in the most severe way. Our guest today is Jerry Roberts. Now, at the moment, he's president of the Deep River Historical Society, which is right up the river from the former Pettapog, but he's an expert on that British raid on Essex. He's researched the event, wrote a book about it, and he was even director of the Connecticut River Museum in Essex Village, which is located right where that raid took place. Jerry, I want to start off talking about the War of 1812 itself. I mean, here we were 35 years, not even, after the end of the Revolutionary War, a 7-year war with the British, and we're picking another fight with them with the War of 1812. Can you, in the 25 words or less category, kind of summarize what was the War of 1812 all about and what were we doing fighting Britain again?
First of all, Connecticut and New England did not want to fight this war. England was our best trading partner. We were growing wealthy trading with England. It was the hawks, if you will. They wanted to get England mostly out of Ohio and Michigan because we wanted to expand the country in that direction. We wanted to get the Indians out of those areas, and to get the Indians out, you had to get the British out because the British had a very good relationship with the Indians there. So, and then the other thing is we thought that we could liberate Canada. We thought that if we marched into Canada, that the Canadians would welcome us and say, can we become part of America? So we fought the war to liberate Canada, and as it turned out, they did not want to be liberated, to get the British out of the Midwest. And then the catchphrase was the impressment, the fact that British Navy ships were impressing American sailors.
Would you explain for the listeners who don't understand the term impressment, what that actually meant?
So Britain was locked in this long, long battle with Napoleon. And the Royal Navy These ships had 800 men on them, these men of war. They needed sailors. So they claimed the right that any British sailor who deserted and got onto a foreign ship, that they had the right to take that sailor away. Oh, impressment was basically the British would walk into, in England, they'd walk into any bar and they'd round up any eligible men and impress them into the Navy. Now these guys are on ships. They don't want to be on ships. So as soon as a British ship would come to America, they jump ship and join an American ship. And so the British felt they had the right to stop American ships at sea and search the ship and take British deserters off. But they also took people that weren't necessarily British deserters. And the straw that broke the camel's back is they actually stopped an American Navy ship. And so you've got a foreign nation stopping one of our Navy ships, overpowering it and taking sailors off of it. So that was part of the big American beef against England. And the whole thing was freedom of the seas and sailors' rights.
So now let's talk about what happened with the trade and why New England was so upset. The British warships, they were actually blockading ships from conducting the trade, correct?
We had a great trade with them. It's when we started the war and invaded Canada for some insane reason. We invaded Canada 9 times during that war, and every single time were repelled. But yes, the British then put a blockade on all of the American ports as they basically shut down Long Island Sound. States like Connecticut, whose livelihood depended on trading with the British, we were totally against the war. You know, we're not allowed to trade with Britain because of the war. Our merchant ships are blockaded. So shipping ports along the river, including Essex, which was then called Pettipog, which built ships and had merchant ships, our merchant shipping was shut down by the British. So we started building and equipping privateers. So the president would give a license to a privateer to go out and hunt down British merchant ships, bring them back to American ports. The cargoes would be sold off at auction. The ships would be sold off, and the profits would be split between the United States government and the people who owned the privateer. Basically, it's a way of privatizing a navy. So the British knew that we were building privateers in little places like Essex, and you can't get to Essex very well in a big British man of war. We're 6 miles up from Long Island Sound. We're very shallow at the mouth of the river. So we were building privateers up in Essex, believing that there's no way the British could ever come up to get our privateers.
So we build these privateers and we go after British ships and take their cargo. I always had the impression that the British ships were so much better than ours. How did we manage to overtake them?
First of all, we were great shipbuilders. I mean, we were really good shipbuilders. I mean, we've been doing this for a long time already. We would never attack British warships because you wouldn't you wouldn't survive that experience. So our privateers would go out and find British merchant ships to attack. And some of our privateers were pretty decent sized and pretty well armed, and they were like military ships. A merchant ship might carry 6 cannons for defense against pirates, but if they're attacked by an American privateer that has 20 guns, they're going to get outgunned. And we built very good ships.
So I'm a merchant sailor. I'm based in Essex, Pettipog at the time. I'm shut down from trading, so I'm going to turn my boat into a privateer boat. Does that mean that I'm just parking my business for now and I'm going to turn into essentially a military guy, or was I doing both?
Some shipping companies, they took the masts down, they stored them for the duration of the war. Others said, yes, let me get a license to become a privateer. Some privateers were merchant ships that were turned into privateers, but the good privateers were purposely built to be privateers. It was serving your country because it served our country to go out and capture British merchant ships because you were depriving the British troops of supplies. You could make some money doing it. So it was a totally legitimate thing to do. You had to be very careful who you were attacking because the Royal Navy was always patrolling, trying to get our privateers, of course.
So now let's talk about what happened during this raid on Essex and how they pulled it off, because I guess they knew that the privateer boats were being built in Pettipog or Essex, but they really didn't know how to sort of navigate their way up the Connecticut River there because it was 6 miles inland. They didn't know who was on either side, and they wanted to get to those boats, but they just didn't know how to do it, right?
The story really quickly is Stephen Decatur was our greatest naval captain. Stephen Decatur went out early in the war with the USS United States, captured the HMS Macedonian out at sea, brought the shot up ships back to New London to be repaired, then took them to New York to be totally refurbished. And now Stephen Decatur and an American squadron are going to put back out to sea. The British don't want that because Decatur's a really good captain. So the British surround New York Harbor with warships. And so Decatur makes a run for it up through Long Island Sound. So the British are racing on the outside of Long Island, and we're racing up the Sound to try to get out through the race, near Montauk. The British beat us, cut Stephen Decatur and his squadron off. So they put into New London, and New London, they're totally safe under the guns of Fort Trumbull and so forth. But now the British, all they have to do is blockade New London for the rest of the war, and they have our best squadron captured. So President Madison offered a bounty for any American sailor or seaman who could go out and blow up some of the British ships that were part of the squadron blockading New London. They would be given half the value of a ship that they blew up. So you had all these young bucks out of Stonington going out in rowboats with gunpowder and dynamite trying to blow up British ships. And in one of those encounters, the British captured one of these guys, and they were going to hang him. They called him Torpedo Jack because any floating bomb was called a torpedo. And he said, wait. I know Essex really well. I can guide you up the Connecticut River where you could get these privateers that are being built. And so now the British have an American trader pilot to guide them. They take their best young officer, Captain Richard Coote, a really hot officer who had already captured 24 American ships in Long Island Sound. And they give him the job of going up into Essex to burn the privateers of Pettipon, which is what Essex was called. Now, you can't get a British warship up over the sandbars at the mouth of the river. So they brought several British warships, anchored them off of the mouth of the river at night. They put 136 British sailors and Marines in 6 large rowing boats, and they rowed against the current. They first landed at the mouth of the river to capture the fort that was there. They found the fort totally abandoned, even though it had guns and everything, because of a dispute between Connecticut that did not want the war and the federal government. The federal government wanted to be in command of Connecticut's troops, and the Connecticut's governor said, no, we won't be commanded by federal officers. And so the federal government withheld funding, so the fort was abandoned for a couple of months, right when the British came up it. So they got back in their boats, they rowed up to Essex in the middle of the night, landed in Essex, took over the town, started burning ships. They captured 2 of our best privateers that they decided to take down the river with them. They overstayed their plan. Now, broad daylight, they've got to come down the river. Meanwhile, we've had a chance to alarm all of our militias along the river, and we had 600 men at the mouth of the river, right where the Baldwin Bridge is now, and started putting gun emplacements in. And Captain Coote is up there in Essex, now broad daylight, 6 miles deep into American territory, bringing his 6 boats and these 2 captured privateers down the river. About halfway down the river, they went aground. So now they're sitting ducks, broad daylight, American troops everywhere. Major Marsh Ely sends an officer to row out to the British and to demand Captain Richard Coote to surrender the British forces. They sent a note that said, good job, you burned a lot of our ships, great stuff, but now you're all going to die. So in the name of humanity, give yourselves up. And we have all of the journals from the British officers. And later on, they made fun of how badly this American ultimatum was written. It was misspelled. The penmanship was bad. And he basically sent the American officer back ashore with a note from Captain Coote saying, basically, we appreciate your appeal to humanity, but we hold your ability to detain us at defiance. In other words, good luck. I don't think you can stop us. And the Americans were blown away. We've got 600 men, cannons, and they're up the river aground. And they're saying, we're not going to surrender because we don't think you can stop us from getting out. The rest of the day, we built up more troops who actually dug in gun emplacements, and it was going to be a slaughter at the mouth of the river. Meanwhile, the British, who have their huge squadron off of New London, they send another huge man of war, and they plan on sending more troops up to rescue the troops that are already up there. But Captain Coote coolly sits in the middle of the river, with these two American ships and all his men, and waits until darkness. And it was a dark night, drizzling, overcast, pitch black. And of course, we saw that he was going to do this. So we try to race cannons up to where we can hit him where he is. We finally got a cannon into position at nightfall, and we fired our cannon until it blew up because it was so hot, and killed a couple of British Marines. They burned our privateers they were taking with them because they couldn't get them out in these conditions. But they rowed back down the river. Now there's a gauntlet of 600 Americans with cannons firing from both sides of the river as these guys go down the river, and they manage to get out to their squadron of ships that are waiting outside the mouth of the river. And the Americans, who had been firing wildly into the night, would stop every now and then to listen. And one of the times they stopped, they hear from out in the harbor or out the mouth of the river, huge roar of troops cheering the British guys as they return to their ships. So they pulled it off.
So let's try and paint a picture of what it looked like in Essex Village itself, which was right there on the river where all these boats were. And this was the biggest loss of boating, shipping in the United States between really 1812 and when Pearl Harbor happened and that devastation there. And I think it's hard maybe for people to understand. I know it's hard for me to wrap my head around this. There were 25 boats in that harbor. The Marines secure the town. The sailors start to burn these ships. This must have been quite a spectacle.
When we learned that the British were coming up the river, all of our militia units would report down to Old Saybrook. That's where they would get their orders. We only had maybe a dozen militiamen in Essex. So now you've got 136 Royal Marines, highly trained people that have been fighting Napoleon in Europe. They're doing an amphibious landing. They're coming in with big cannons in those, even though these are rowboats, they had pretty significant sized cannons in them, and they're shelling the town. Our militia fired one round and got one cannon shot off, and then they were just overwhelmed and they left the town. So the British land in the town. The populace comes out, in their nightgowns at 2:30 in the morning, 3 o'clock in the morning, and Captain Coote steps out with his Marines and he says, "Listen, folks, here's the deal. We have not come to hurt you or to hurt your personal property or your homes. We've come here to burn the shipping of the town, which is a legitimate, war target. Let us do our job. We'll get out of here as quick as we can. If you resist us, if you start taking shots at my men, we will then have to retaliate and burn the town." There was no deal made. We didn't make a deal with the British. The people just did the math and understood that we had nothing that could stop these folks. Our folks stayed out of their way. They packed their wagons, took their valuables. The British went about burning ships. To their honor, a couple of times these burning ships started a couple house roofs on fire, and the British officers ordered their men to extinguish those fires. And people ask, why didn't the British just go ahead and burn the town? Because the safest thing that Captain Coote could do for his own men was to do that carrot and stick thing. Like, we won't burn your town, but don't shoot our men. Because if Coote had started burning American houses, then our people would have had nothing to lose, and there would have been a guerrilla war in the streets, and Coote didn't want that. He wanted to burn ships and get out of there.
Whatever happened to Torpedo Jack after this whole thing was over?
One of the things we wanted to find out is what happened to Captain Coote. He was immediately promoted. He was given a much larger ship. He was engaged to a very prominent woman in London. Her young brother, who was a bit of a screw-up, had been kicked out of university in England. She appealed to her fiancé, Richard Coote, to take her young brother with him as a midshipman, which he did. And the young brother was right there with Coote during the battle. And so he's now a hero as well. So the young woman back in England hears her fiance has just pulled off this amazing raid, and her screw-up young brother is now a hero as well and is decorated. And that's all good. We wanted to find out what happened to Richard Coote afterwards. So we searched the British records for an Admiral Coote, because certainly he should have become an admiral soon after this. Didn't find an Admiral Coote. Didn't find Coote a year later. We also tried to find out about this traitor. And we finally, by getting all the logbooks from the British ships involved, that night that the guy was captured off of New London, an Ezekiel Jackson was brought aboard with a torpedo. That means an explosive bomb. So Ezekiel Jackson was Torpedo Jack. So we found our traitor, Ezekiel Jackson. So what happened to him? When Richard Coote was promoted, given a much larger ship, he took with him the young midshipman, his fiance's brother, and he took Torpedo Jack with him because Torpedo Jack would be hung if he came ashore in America. So Ezekiel Jackson, the young midshipman, and Richard Coote are now in this much larger ship. How come we couldn't find Richard Coote as an admiral? We found several of his officers. Lieutenant Perry became an admiral, and was Perry who explored the Arctic, later became very famous. But Coote, couldn't find him. So what we found out is 3 months after this attack, Coote was in his much larger ship, sailing around the shoals off of North Carolina, these horrible shoals. The ship was lost at sea in the storm. So Coote dies, the young midshipman dies, and the traitor dies. And imagine this poor woman back in England who had just heard that her fiance was a hero, her brother was a hero, and then she gets word a couple months later that he's lost at sea. But at least we felt that Torpedo Jack got his just rewards.
It was such a significant loss of boats in one attack that it didn't happen again until the U.S. military conflict in Hawaii on a day that will live in infamy, December 7th, 1941. Yes, the Pearl Harbor raid. The War of 1812 incidentally killed 15,000 Americans, and it ended just 10 months after that raid on Essex. Well, that wraps up this episode of Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path. The village of Pettapog, of course, suffered greatly during that British raid. Their economy was shattered, several wealthy families were ruined, it took years to rebuild, and one of the things that changed after the raid was their name. They put Pettapog to bed and came up with the name Essex to replace it. I want to thank our guest for today's program, Jerry Roberts, author of the book, The British Raid on Essex, very knowledgeable. And if you want to know even more, you can visit Jerry's website at jerrypaulroberts.com. Again, that's jerrypaulroberts.com. The answer to this week's trivia question, the question was, it's often called Connecticut's most abundant natural resource. What is it? And the answer is rocks, of course. That's right, rocks. Those pesky objects that we find in virtually every yard and garden in the state, at least in mine. Next week on Amazing Tales CT, we're going to speak with the foremost expert in New England on stone walls. And believe me, you're not going to believe how much there is to talk about regarding stone walls. It's an absolutely fascinating topic. Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path is a production of True North Associates, LLC. This is Mike Allen. Be safe and stay healthy.